Hello, I'm Lucy McCartney, Student Achievement Officer at the Literacy and Numeracy Secretariat. On behalf of the Literacy and Numeracy Secretariat and Curriculum Services Canada, it's my pleasure to welcome you again to our monthly professional learning webcast. Our focus today is on assessment literacy. Joining me from the Literacy and Numeracy Secretariat is a colleague of mine, Dr. Carol Campbell, lead of the Research, Evaluation, and Data Management team. Dr. Campbell has international experience in research, evaluation, and policy work, including work in all parts of the United Kingdom, across Europe, the United States, and Canada. Prior to joining the Secretariat, Dr. Campbell was a faculty member at the Institute of Education, University of London. During her stay in England, she was seconded as a policy advisor for the central government in the Department for Education and Skills. Dr. Campbell offers some key messages based on the research of her team and has the pleasure of introducing our special guest.
Welcome to today's webcast, Rethinking Classroom Assessment with Purpose in Mind. The Literacy and Numeracy Secretariat is committed to the appropriate and effective use of assessment data to inform teaching strategies and to support all students to learn and achieve. We support the use of data for individual students in classrooms, in schools, in districts and at the provincial level. As a province, we have increasing capacity in the use, analysis and understanding of assessment data. For example, within the Secretariat, we routinely analyse data at provincial, regional, district and school levels to inform our strategies and to focus our actions. Our Student Achievement Officers work with educators across the province to support assessment literacy. Our strategic commitments include promoting increased use of strategies for assessment of learning and assessment for learning, which you'll hear more about today, data-driven decision-making, and differentiating assessment and instruction. In our previous webcasts, we've spoken about the use of assessment and data, including the disaggregation of data to support equity of outcome for all student groups, and the use of data to inform strategies for differentiating instruction. Assessment, teaching, and learning are interconnected, requiring attention to their integration within the classroom. As Michael Fullen, Peter Hill and Carmel Cravola have said, there is no value in assessing students if it does not impact on learning and on instruction. And that's the purpose of our webcast today. As we develop more precision in utilising student achievement data, it enables us to ask and to address questions about developing appropriate teaching strategies and learning objectives to support all students to learn and to succeed, to both raise the bar of higher achievement and to close the gap of underachievement. From our own research here in Ontario, we have evidence about the benefits and the use of assessment literacy to support teaching and learning. For example, in one project that we conducted called the Successful Sites Project, we spoke to school boards, authorities and schools across Ontario about the factors that supported successful literacy and numeracy practice. And across 163 sites, you told us about the benefits of assessment and data to support literacy and numeracy teaching. And you spoke about using assessment and data to guide your instruction, to inform your classroom practice, and to support sustainability and improvement. In another project that we were involved in, the Effective District-Wide Strategies project, we worked with 8 school boards across Ontario, and again, a very important finding was about the use of board-wide assessment policies and practices to support schools in the use of student data and assessment. So in this webcast, Dr. Lorna Earle discusses rethinking classroom practices and assessment with purpose in mind. Our featured guest, Dr. Lorna Earle, is a recognised researcher, an international author and a leader in the field of assessment and evaluation. Currently, Dr. Earle has joined us here at the Ministry as a researcher in residence. Prior to that, Lorna has a long history in education research in Ontario. She was Associate Professor in the Theory and Policy Studies Department and Head of the International Centre for Educational Change at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. Dr. Earle's expertise covers 25 years as a research officer and a research director in school districts, and she was the first Director of Assessment in Education Quality and Accountability Office. In this webcast, Dr. Earle highlights three main purposes of assessment: assessment for learning, assessment as learning, and assessment of learning, and how these can be brought together in your classroom practices.
The first thing I want to do is just give you an overview of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about four different kinds of things. I'm going to talk about the kind of historical and where we are now in terms of a focus on evidence and using data and how that fits in education. I'm going to talk very specifically about classroom assessment, because classroom assessment is really at the core, in my view, and I think in the view of many others, and particularly at the core of learning. So I want to talk about classroom assessment for and as learning. And then I want to talk about quality, the quality in the kind of assessment that we do in classrooms every day. Because quality actually matters. Because doing classroom assessment is actually measurement. So it matters that you have good quality in the classroom assessment. So that's kind of overview. And I want to start by, first of all, doing this, why evidence, why data, what's going on? We're actually awash in data at the moment. We're drowning in data. Most of you, in your own years as students, didn't have any experience with data. I mean, I love it now that in our numeracy curriculum, we teach data management and probability starting in about grade 2. I didn't hit it till I was in graduate school. It's becoming a language of understanding the world that we live in. And particularly a world that is focused on accountability on one hand, but on the other hand, it is a mechanism for actually starting to understand what it is we do, why we do it this way, and for being able to make very quick adjustments to plans so that our decisions are more evidence-based or data-based rather than being somebody's best judgment at a point in time or coupled with somebody's best judgment. Now, when you think about a history of assessment, I want you to think way back. I'm going to go way back to Plato. What do you think about when you think about assessment in Plato's time? What's your image of Plato? And I'll tell you what mine is. Mine is, Plato and Socrates sitting under a tree with 3 or 4 other people around. They were all men, because men were the ones who were educated at that point in time. And what was the assessment? The assessment was dialogos. It was dialogue. It was conversation. What do you think about that? How can we add to that? Challenging one another's thinking, being prepared to argue and build increased understanding from doing that. I'm going to move then up in history a bit to the trade guilds. Think about the trade guilds, particularly in England. What was assessment during that time in history? Assessment during that time in history was what we would call today performance assessment. If I'm studying in a trade to be a potter, then my assessment is somebody looking over my shoulder saying, hey, pull it up from the bottom, pull it up from the bottom. If you don't, it's going to fly off the top. And watching me and expecting in the early parts of my apprenticeship that all I'm going to be able to do is even center the clay on the wheel. But after a while, looking for finer and finer control. And not everyone gets to be the finest potter who works with porcelain. Some of them become the kind of bog standard potters who do the regular stuff. And a few become the serious experts. But the assessment in this case is watching and using criteria about what is successful, what is good pottery, to make the judgment. Moving then to the Industrial Revolution and legislated universal education. They came at the same time, and they came at the same time not by chance, but very much because they were part of the same historical context. It was a time in history when people were moving from small towns and villages and from rural areas to cities to work in these new industries that have been developed. And they had to have some basic literacy, numeracy, so that they could function, so that they could write home, so that they could get letters from home, so that they could count their pay, because it was now a monetary system rather than a system of barter. And what was assessment then in the Industrial Revolution and the universal education? Because universal education was by itself really designed to support three things. Universal education, because people were now living in urban areas, was to ensure they had literacy and numeracy at a very low level, nothing very fancy, to acculturate, and particularly in this continent, more perhaps even than in Europe, because there were large numbers of people coming, this is the turn of the last century, large numbers of people coming from all over, in that case, Western Europe. They were coming from war-torn countries, they were coming out of religious persecution, they were coming out of poverty, they were coming to create new lives. Part of what universal education was designed to do was to bring this community together. Not so different from what we have now, just from different parts of the world. And the third purpose of universal education was actually sorting and selecting, deciding who gets more of this universal education that we are providing, because it wasn't designed to say everybody gets it forever to the highest level possible. It was really everybody needs this much, and then a few need some more, and then a very small number of those need even more than that. So assessment at that time in history, and through most of the 20th century, was based on things like tests and exams and projects and all of the kinds of things that all of us have grown up with their purpose being helping decide who gets more. Because not everybody is going to get this whole educational opportunity. We've now moved into an era of what is termed high-quality education for all. It's even high-quality learning for all. It is that there's really a place for everyone, and that people need to have education to be able to move forward. That's an essential part of their future. How many of you, just by a show of hands, how many of you grew up in families where your parents said, whatever I do, you'll have more education than I did? Yeah. That's part of our century, that having more education is the ticket. It's the currency that gets you ahead. So we're now in an environment where high-quality education for all is the purpose. It isn't sorting and selecting. And assessment is no longer who gets more, but assessment takes on a different cast in this high-quality education for all environment. And the cast that it takes on is what Paul Black talks about in the power of assessment to enhance learning. It's a quote that Paul Black has in one of his books, that improvement in student achievement from high-quality formative assessment has the potential to raise a school in the lower quartile, he's in England, of the UK national performance tables to well above average. High-quality formative assessment is actually proving to be one of the most powerful tools for learning. So I'm going to tell you a little story to try to demonstrate this. It's a story about my niece. My niece's name is Joanna. She hates that I tell this story because she's now 17 and about to go off to university next year. And it happened when she was 4 or 5 years old. And Jojo came to me one day and she said, you know, Aunt Lorna, all cats are girls and all dogs are boys. That's kind of interesting. I said, how do you know that? How do you know cats are girls and dogs are boys? Now, just an aside, I've discovered, having told this story many times, that there are a lot of adults who still somewhere in their brains believe that cats are girls and dogs are boys. But I asked Jo, how do you know that? And she said, well, you have a cat, and her name's Molly, and she's a girl, and she's little and smooth. You know, girls are little and smooth, cats are girls. And there's a dog who lives next door. I don't remember what his name is, but he's big and he's rough. He's a boy. Dogs are boys. Boys are big and rough. Yeah. It's pretty sophisticated logic. And this is what we try to get kids to do, isn't it? Have a hypothesis, test it with evidence. If it holds, you've got supporting evidence. So I thought about it for a minute. I thought, I could probably say to her at this point, it's not really like that. Cats can be girls and boys, and so can dogs. And she would have accepted it. She likes me. I'm a kind of favorite aunt, so she would have said yeah. But she probably would go away thinking to herself, I have to remember when I talk to Aunt Lorna that she thinks cats can be boys and girls. Or she might be thinking, I'm not talking to Aunt Lorna about this sex stuff anymore because she clearly doesn't get it. But how many of your kids sit in your classrooms saying, I have to remember that that's what the teacher thinks? And how long do they have to remember it? Till the test. How many of you have things stored in your brain you still don't understand, that you can't get rid of, that you had to remember for the test, that are still there floating around without anything that hooks them? The story goes on like this. What I did do with Jo at that point was, instead of telling her, I showed her a book. You've probably all seen it. It's a coffee table book. It's a big book. It's just called Dogs. It's got all kinds of pictures of dogs in it. I showed her a picture of a Chihuahua. What's this? It's a dog. Boy or girl? It's a boy. Dogs are boys. But it's little and smooth. Yeah, sometimes they can be little and smooth. So one criterion out the window. Showed her a picture of a big setter with all her puppies. What's this? It's a dog. It's a boy or girl. Long paws. Not very happy. Said, it could be the dad. Said, Jo, do you think it's the dad? She said, Aunt Lorna, can dogs be girls? What I'd like to suggest is that's how learning happens. Learning happens when what we believe to be true is challenged by new information that we cannot fit into the schema that we've developed to try to explain the world around us. That's how learning happens. And in this case, what I did was create the conditions for Joanna to see that what she believed to be true might not hold. I gave her feedback. I didn't give her feedback by telling her what was wrong with her thinking. I gave her feedback by creating the conditions where she could see that her thinking didn't apply as well as she thought it did. So think about it for a minute. What's your JoJo story? Think about something in your life that you believed to be true that was at some point challenged by new information. And you had to stand back and say, oh my God, isn't that silly? And we're going to ask you to share your stories if you'd be willing to do that, or at least a couple of you.
I don't know if mine's a fantastic example, but just when you mentioned it, it's the first thing I thought of. So just my own perspective on people with special needs. You know, I hadn't really encountered them on a personal level, or you know, I'd encountered them in my life, and you know, as a group, you know, and there's so many different special needs. You know, you can't group them together, and that's basically what I learned. My sister-in-law has Down syndrome, and just encountering her, she's a fantastic person, and just, you know, connecting with her on a personal level, you learn a lot about yourself and about people in general.
Yeah.
So
I think that's a great example. Having some preconceived notions that were not, because it wasn't part of your experience, you just take with you what you may know, and having the experience really changes it. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes.
Last year, my mother was living with us, and she was quite elderly. She was 90 years old, and as she started to decrease, we had to put her in a nursing home. And my 4-year-old daughter at the time was really quite upset that my mom was moving. And as it is, my mom passed away in the summer, and this is going back some time later. I wasn't feeling well, and I was laying on the couch, and my daughter came up to me and said, I'm going to take care of you, Mommy. She was covering me, and I'm going to take care of you because you don't want to get sick and go to the hospital. And I said, no, Mommy doesn't want to go to the hospital. No, because if you go to the hospital, you're going to die and go to heaven with Grandma. And I said, well, Annalisa, is that what happens all the time? Yeah, because Grandma went to with the nurses and she went to heaven. And I said, well, but Mommy went to the hospital last year, and did she come home or did she go to heaven? And she came home, so it was sort of a learning moment for her.
Absolutely. Yes, good example. These are both, I think, excellent examples that capture that these are everyday parts of our lives. We have these all the time, views of the world that I like to think of as what I believe to be true. And we have this incredible capacity as human beings to believe that what I believe to be true is true. You know? And the fact that Rosa doesn't quite see the world the way I see the world is only because she doesn't know enough yet. If she knew what I knew, she would see it my way. Without really recognizing that every one of us sits with those same convictions about what we believe to be true. They just are what our experience has given us and what we come to see as the normal state of affairs that may not be shared widely or at all beyond some small groups or sometimes much larger groups, but are still those experientially created images of the world around us. So classroom assessment, doing assessment, actually has the potential for unlocking those kinds of things, finding out what it is people believe to be true. When I ask Joanna questions, when you ask your daughter questions, you're finding out what it is they believe to be true so that you're able to decide what you're going to do next, that you're going to give them feedback, that you're going to provide more information, you're going to create teachable moments. So more classroom assessment is not the answer. You know, just doing more is not enough. It's doing the right kinds. It's getting the kind of classroom assessment that actually allows you to use it for various purposes at different points in time, and to do it with all of the students in your class. That you're not teaching one-on-one, but what you want is to personalize or individualize learning. And you can use assessment to allow you to do that in a way that actually gives you images of what all the kids are thinking about and the way they're seeing the world around them. There are 3 different purposes of classroom assessment that I want to just highlight, and these are actually spelled out in much more detail in some of the resources that are part of the resource guide to this webcast. But the 3 purposes are assessment for learning, assessment as learning, and assessment of learning. Assessment for learning is when teachers use assessment to be able to understand what it is that youngsters are thinking so that you're able to decide what you're going to do next instructionally. Assessment as learning is actually a subset, if you like, of assessment for learning, but we've pulled it out separately as a separate idea because ultimately what you want are that children can actually self-assess. And by that I don't mean self-mark. You know, this isn't marking their own work. It is that they become good, self-reflective, self-monitoring thinkers in the way that if any of us write, as you write something, if you're writing a paper for a course or even writing a report, you read it and you think about, that's not quite what I wanted to say. You self-monitor, you go back, you rethink it, you add another idea, you reorganize it. That you want young people to become good self-monitors so that they're able to see where they need to go next or where they need to go for help and when they need to go for help. Because we want learning to be a process where they move as efficiently as possible through the learning continuum. We don't want kids to be stuck in misconceptions, misunderstandings, or inappropriate understandings of what it is they're trying to become knowledgeable about. We don't want them thinking many years later that if anyone goes to hospital, that means they're going to die. That can create all kinds of other almost unimaginable weirdnesses in their thinking over time. So assessment as learning is them becoming good at that themselves. Assessment of learning is what we typically do in classrooms. Assessment of learning is assessment almost for accreditation or for decision making. It's when we say we're going to do a report for the parents, or we're going to do a decision about placement or decisions about promotion, that we need evidence to be able to make those judgments and make those judgments well. The graphic of the triangles shows two different triangles. One that is the, if you like, typical balance or current balance of assessment for, as, and of learning. And the other one is the one that I'd like to suggest we should be working toward. That at the moment, most of the assessment that we do in schools is assessment of learning. It is assessment with the purpose of reporting, communicating, accrediting, making those kinds of decisions. That most teachers do assessment for learning, as in they collect information about how kids are learning various concepts, often done informally, but you do it in order to decide what you're going to do next. And assessment as learning, intentionally working with young people to help them get good at judging their own learning, happens rarely. It's usually something that happens when it jumps out at you in a day, because teachers work through whole days of making constant decisions. You're making decisions in your lessons all the time, and you're changing the lessons depending on kids. What you may not be doing is working intentionally to create in them that capacity and the automaticity in monitoring their own work, thinking about where they need to go next, asking for help or getting help in a variety of ways. So I like to think that the balance should actually flip on its head, that assessment as learning should be the biggest part of the pyramid, that assessment for learning should sit on top of that, and that assessment of learning should actually happen fairly rarely. It may include a lot of evidence from across a whole term or a whole unit of work. It's not that you don't pay attention to all of the information you collect. It's that each time you do assessment, it is not a decision point. It can be a learning point. The next slide is called Planning the Assessment Process. And what I'd like to do is go through that slide just as it's an organizer, it's a way of thinking, to say when you're planning your assessment process, what should you be thinking about? Because you should always be assessing with the end in mind. What am I going to use this for? Why am I doing this assessing? So you start with, why am I assessing? What is the purpose? Am I assessing at the moment so I can decide what I'm going to do differently? Am I assessing so that I can help students become better at making decisions about their own learning? Or am I assessing because I have some communication I need to do, where I need some solid evidence to be able to do that and feel confident that I'm giving good information to someone else or making a good decision about this student? Once you know why you're assessing, and many of you will say, I do all of these things and I do them all and I mix them all up together. And in fact, you probably do. But as you try to actually deconstruct them, one of the things that happens is that when you do things for one purpose, you actually can make it hard for it to be useful for another. Now let me give you an example. If what I want to do is get kids to self-assess, if I want them to start self-monitoring or to be engaged in self-monitoring, and I'm going to mark that and it becomes part of what counts, why would I as a kid be even remotely willing to share with you, the teacher, what I don't understand? Why would I be willing to make that visible if you're going to use that against me when you mark me? So you need to create the conditions where kids can actually feel comfortable doing self-monitoring and not being right. Because in fact, lots of the time that we're learning, we're not right. That's what learning's about. If you knew it already, if it were already comfortable and automatic, then it wouldn't be part of what you're trying to accomplish. So you need to think about why you're assessing really clearly up front. Then you need to think about, what am I assessing? What are the curriculum targets? What are the skills? What is the content? What is it that I'm trying in this case to accomplish with this group of kids? Because if you aren't clear about what that is, you can be distracted by all kinds of other things that are going on. I'm going to give an example a bit about that in a minute. Then what assessment method will I use? Often asked, so what kinds of assessment methods do you use for assessment for, and what kinds of assessment methods do you use for assessment of? And the answer is all of them for all of them. There are not better assessment methods for each purpose. It's how you use the assessment that you do for the purpose that you intend. It's matching them. So you can use worksheets for assessment for learning. You can use tests to unlock what it is they believe to be true. It's not the form, that it's what you're trying to do with it, and then getting the best form for what it is you want to do. How can I assure quality? I'm going to come back to the quality question later, because I said earlier quality is an important piece of this that we really have to, I think, in education pay more attention to. That we actually don't necessarily think about the quality of our assessments as much as we might. Then what can I learn from this assessment? And you'll see there are two different tabs here. What can I learn from this assessment, and what am I going to do with it? Those are different things. What can I learn from it is, what is it that I'm learning about this kid or group of kids learning? What is it I now know about how they learn that I didn't know before? Then, how am I going to use it? Is, what does that trigger in terms of teaching strategies, resources, support, whatever kinds of things you might bring into the picture to decide how you're going to move on. So let me back up for a minute and talk about assessment for learning. Assessment for learning now is the one where teachers use the assessment to decide what they're going to do next. Identifying what it is they believe to be true. This is where you get specific information on each student's learning paths. I suspect you now in many of your classrooms have got assessment walls, and you're starting to track kids' learning as they move through. Is that true? Yeah? This is being clear. What are the curriculum outcomes? What are the things we're trying to accomplish? How does that show itself? How do I then make sense of that? It gives you detailed information on prior knowledge and on misconceptions and on errors in thinking. You need to know the learning progression. You need to know the common misconceptions. And you need to design the assessment to allow you to actually unpack that information. Here's a pretty good example of that. This is place value in decimals. It's the next slide. If you put a question on a worksheet that's place the following numbers in order of smallest to largest, and what you're after is the kids' understanding of place value. You've got 4 numbers there, 0.01, 0.67, 0.931, 0.32. I'm sure all of you can sit here and order them right now from smallest to largest. And you might from that assume, if kids could do that, that they understand place value. But if you look at those numbers and you take out all the decimals, it would order exactly the same way if all they did was look at them as if they were whole numbers. They don't have to understand place value to answer that question. The next one, however, select the largest number from the following list. The largest number, if they take out the decimals, is 125. The largest number, if they understand place value, is 1.4. So you need to construct assessment items so that they allow you to see the common misconceptions. What is it that kids would do if they didn't get this? And there may be 5 or 6 different ways that they could misunderstand place value. What you want to do is to be able to identify which ones have got the concept solidly in hand, which ones don't get even decimals, which ones perhaps understand a little bit about it, but they get confused when they have whole numbers and decimal places. Why do you want to do that? Because you can't teach every single kid one at a time, but you can teach 3 groups that concept by grouping those kids into those who need this kind of instruction, those who need that kind of instruction, those who need, even to go back to number facts. You can make those kinds of judgments if you create your assessment items in ways that they give you insight into what it is they believe to be true. So when you're using assessment for learning, what you want to be able to do from that learning, as I say, is grouping. You want to be able to group them for instruction so that you can differentiate your instruction. And it's by continually checking where each student is, and then you do grouping and regrouping and regrouping and regrouping, depending on the concepts, the ideas, the learning expectations that you're working on. You also want to be able to provide students with very accurate descriptive feedback. The feedback loop in learning is the most powerful part of this assessment activity. It is, as soon as you know what it is they misunderstand, creating the conditions for them to see what they should do next so that they get it, so that it's actually a successful next step in their learning. It's not just either, and we've all experienced this, that was really good work, you got 19 out of 20, but you still don't know what you did right. Or what's even worse, struggling with this. Pay more attention to your homework. Practice. But without insight into what it is they don't get. That feedback needs to be very specific, very direct, and allow the students to make sense of where they are and where they want to go. I'm going to give you a little example from some time that I spent in England with a team who were working on the national literacy and numeracy strategies there, and we had this great privilege of being able to sit in classrooms all over England and watch teachers teach the literacy and numeracy lessons in the strategies. I sat in one that was particularly good, and I'm going to give you it as an example of using assessment for learning. What the teacher did was start the literacy hour, as you may know, has a kind of 3-part lesson. It starts with a group activity, and then they go off and work in smaller groups, and then they come back together for a full class at the end. In the first part of it, they were looking at a book. They were doing, it's kind of a big book, and it was reading, looking at the title, trying to predict what was going to happen, typical beginning activities. The curriculum target for the day, and you notice I'm saying curriculum target, they also had numerical targets as we have in Ontario, but they very quickly moved from where are we on reaching our numerical target to which of the curriculum targets are each of our kids achieving. So it's very much about instruction and about expectations, about learning. The curriculum target for the day was on using expressive language, particularly adjectives, in written work. And what the teacher did was to talk about what adjectives were, what expressive language was, in terms of using an adjective, using expressive or figurative language is a way of making something come alive. Making people be able to see it or hear it or smell it or feel it by having words that made it work for them. And then had just a wonderful little activity where she put a bunch of, the story was about vegetables. So she had a bunch of vegetables, and these vegetables were taking over the garden. A bunch of vegetables, and asked them to think about words that would describe these vegetables. So somebody said it was a a massive tomato. Say, okay, why did you choose the word massive? What does massive tomato conjure up for people? What might the massive tomato be doing? So it was all about building this figurative language. One of the kids said it was a nice carrot. She didn't accept that. It was, well, nice is an adjective, but is it figurative language? What does nice tell us about the carrot? What are some better words? And it's in that feedback. So her questioning was the assessment, was what do kids understand? So you can see how assessment and instruction start to weave together. What's different is she's doing it very, very intentionally. She had planned this to be sure that she was going to get information from all of the kids in the class about their understanding of figurative language in that first little interchange with them. Then she had 4 different groups that they were going to work in. She worked with one very intensively. The other 3 were actually working in quite different ways based on some prior work that she had done. Some of them were actually just replacing words with different words. Others were writing whole sentences using figurative language, depending on how she had unlocked in advance what it was they believed to be true. This is also important when you start talking about providing information to parents. Parents don't always just want to know, how's my kid doing? They want to understand what it is that kids are getting and not getting. And in the same way that very concrete stories and descriptions make sense to you, that's what makes sense to them. Talking to them about what it is you're learning with examples of what it is their children are doing, not as this is an A paper or this is a 19 out of 20 paper, but as this is the kind of learning, this is what I'm doing, this is what you might be doing, can be very powerful in promoting that learning cycle. Now let me move to assessment as learning. And I said that assessment as learning was a kind of subset of assessment for learning. It is promoting self-reflection and self-regulation. It's in the metacognitive sense, that highest level of self-regulating your own thinking and your own control of your thinking and your learning. Kids are never going to be good self-assessors if we don't teach them how. Most of us have never been given instruction in being self-regulated learners. Most of us have learned how to do that as adults. Many people never do. But we want kids to take that on as a way in which they learn. So first thing we need is to have explicit goals and processes for monitoring progress toward them. We need to have goals that are out there that they can see so they know what it is they're working toward. And we need to give them ways of moving toward it, of checking their own. That's where things like exemplars come in. Not just single exemplars, but lots of exemplars. Some of you may even have been in, I think, the grade 13 a number of years ago, when the writer's craft was the 5th credit in grade 13 English. The writer's craft document had in it an absolutely wonderful set of examples, because it had examples of literature that had been written by famous Canadian authors, showing how they self-monitored and self-regulated their writing. How Margaret Atwood took her first scribblings and then started to develop it and went and did more research and came back and changed and reorganized and all the things that she does as she writes, as a way of helping those young adults in grade 13 become self-regulated learners. We need to think about what is the scaffolding, not only for the learning, but the scaffolding for learning how to monitor your own thinking along the way, for knowing when you've got it or when you're not sure or when you really need help. So they need information. There's feedback here as well. Feedback about how well they're doing at their own self-reflection, at their own judgments about their learning. The example that I want to talk about in this one is actually in a document that I've left that people can have a look at, and it's in the resource guide as well, that is called Rethinking Classroom Assessment with Purpose in Mind. And it's an assessment story. I'm going to tell you just a piece of it. It's a teacher who started out at the beginning of a lecture, a lesson on fractions, with a set of 6 carefully developed questions for the students to do to show how they understood fractions before she started teaching. What they did when they were doing that, they each tried to do the questions. They wrote down their thinking as they went. They met with a math buddy, and their responsibility with their math buddies was to explain what they thought this was about. And the math buddy's job was to ask questions for clarification, for deepening understanding. So not to give fixes, to ask questions. At the end of that session with the math buddy, the teacher asked the kids to take colored dots and put a green dot on the ones that you're sure you've figured this one out, you got this one sorted. Yellow's the one where you're not sure about. Red is the one you're really struggling, you don't think you've got it. And she collected those and took them home. And her time was not now correcting a bunch of worksheets. Her time was looking at the thinking on the ones that the kids had identified with red and seeing who those kids were and where they were struggling so that she could decide what she was going to do next in instruction. So you see how it's embedded? She not only is helping them learn how to be good self-assessors, but she's giving them some tools for doing that. She's using it to decide where she's going to go next. If you're going to do this, then you really do have to model and you have to guide self-monitoring. It won't happen on its own. You have to provide regular and challenging opportunities for kids to practice doing it. Because if they aren't practicing it, it doesn't become an automatic part of what they do. You want them to see it as something that they will do even when they're not asked. But that's a long, slow process. You have to monitor their metacognitive processes, monitor how they are doing it, and give them the exemplars, the learning progressions, the rubrics, the things that they need to be able to have these tools to make judgments about their own work. And finally, you have to create an environment where it's safe. Because if it is not safe for them to do that, why would they take it on? What you want is to create those conditions where they can actually become good self-assessors and do that in a way that they are not embarrassed, are not going to be centered out, where not knowing is not a bad thing. It's where you are right now. And our job then collectively is to help you know, is to move that next step as efficiently as we can do it. Now, assessment of learning is the certification and accreditation of performance. It is a summary of each student's level of achievement, and it's the foundation for decisions and discussions about placement or promotion, reporting. And because I'm going to move fairly quickly into talking about quality, this is high stakes. Assessment of learning, which we have done in education in a pretty cavalier fashion, is actually really very high stakes for those kids. It is what, on the foundation on which they build their self-esteem, their sense of themselves as learners, their sense of themselves as having value or worth, because their job is being in school. Their job is learning. And if they aren't learning and they know they aren't learning, and that's being repeatedly pointed out to them in a series of marks on papers, that has a huge impact. For some kids it means, do I get the bicycle or not? Do I get the summer holiday or not? There are all kinds of things that get attached to those decisions. So if we're going to make those kinds of decisions about kids, my caution is we better be very sure that we have high quality assessment on which we're making those judgments, because these aren't trivial. These are important. It has to be fair. It has to be accurate. And it has to be based on detailed information that you have some confidence in, that you can use to decide what you're going to communicate. So a graphic in the pack that is on the teacher's roles. I'm not going to go through those in detail, but you can look at them and think about them, about the ways in which teachers actually shift their behavior depending on whether you're doing assessment for, assessment as, or assessment of learning. That's a summary sheet of the things that I've talked about already. I want to talk a little bit about quality, however, because the quality piece is one that I really worry about. And quality is a function of reliability, reference points, validity, and record keeping. I'm going to start with reliability. Reliability is very simply, how sure am I? How sure am I that I have enough information here and that the information gives me enough insight that I'm making judgments that I have some confidence in? So if I give a test of two-digit additions with regrouping, and I give that test and it's all, I've given 20 items of two-digit additions with regrouping, and let me see, Sylvia got 14 out of 20 right. Does she get it? Maybe. You know, 19 out of 20, she got it. Yeah. 11 out of 20. Yeah. The way in, so you don't have confidence in that. The way in which you increase the reliability, two ways in classroom assessment. More evidence, more eyes. Sometimes it's more evidence. You just don't have enough yet. You have to probe more. I have to give some more items to Sylvia. I might give her items now that are two-digit addition without regrouping. I might give her some that are one digit with regrouping, one digit without regrouping. I might look at number facts. There are all kinds of things that I might probe deeper to find out what's going on with her, because I don't know enough yet to make a good judgment that I have confidence in. More eyes. Particularly when you're looking at things that require considerable interpretation. Having your colleagues look at kids' work with you is one of the most powerful ways to have some confidence that what you see is shared by others. That using the same criteria, using the same exemplars, having the same, if you like, set of expectations in your heads, you come to somewhat the same understanding of this work. And if you don't, then you've got two things you may have to adjust. You may not have enough evidence. You may have wildly different views of what to expect from kids at this age and stage. And that is as much a problem of reliability. Because if we want some consistency across classrooms in a school, across schools, that go across a playground, across schools, across a whole district, if we want parents to feel confident that we're actually all working on the same page, then we have to have some shared expectations and some shared criteria that we hold in our heads. So working on that collectively can help you increase reliability. Now we'll move to reference points. And reference points I'm going to run through very quickly because we all use reference points. You know, you think of using a meter stick as a reference point. The meter stick that lives in Paris in a air-free container so that it keeps its size. I think they now use lasers actually, but that we have a reference point against which we make judgments. We make judgments in education on the basis of 3 different kinds of reference points, and we usually mix them all up together, which makes it really hard to unentangle them. Norm referenced, criterion or outcome referenced, or expectation referenced, and self-referenced. How well is the kid doing in relation to other kids? How well is the kid doing in relation to the expectations? How well is the kid doing in relation to last time I checked? Only we mix those all up together in the funniest of ways, so that it's really hard to know what it means. But we're going to have to untangle them because reference points matter. This is the rubric that wine sniffers use to decipher and to be able to communicate the smells in the wines that they sniff. They're not tasting, they're just sniffing. How many of you think that your students' learning is as complicated as sniffing wine? Yeah? It is. How many of you ever seen a rubric that complex for describing learning? We do these 1, 2, 3, 4. You know, got a little of it, got some more of it, got a bunch of it, got a whole lot. Those are not useful descriptive feedback rubrics. Rubrics that allow you to actually unpack kids' learning are complicated, and they are based on your progression and your knowledge of the progressions of learning. From what does it look like when it first emerges, to what does it look like as we move along, and how can I use that to give information back to help students with their learning. Do the wine sniffers carry this rubric around in their hands while they're sniffing wine? No, they don't. They've got it in their heads. They come together regularly to sniff wine together and calibrate their noses. We need to think about the same things. Coming together regularly to calibrate the standards, the expectations, the criteria that we believe are important along that progression of kids' learning, so that we're able to identify what it is we should do next. And this is where assessment gets tied very, very intentionally to teacher knowledge. You have to know your stuff. You have to know your stuff very deeply. I had a student once who was a secondary math teacher who said to me, you know, I'm a really good math teacher. I just don't know what to do when they don't get it. And as she said it, she looked at me and got this funny look on her face. It was like, oh my God, maybe I'm not. She is very good at mathematics. She gets it. What she doesn't understand is, what does it look like when they don't get it? What is their not getting it path? And what does she have to do to intervene, to change that set of misconceptions, misunderstandings, direction of their thinking? The next quality issue is validity. How well does this assessment represent the concept I'm actually trying to teach? This is saying, or trying to assess, this is saying, let's not call it mathematics if it's really about motion geometry with slips and turns. You know, let's be clear what it is we're assessing, and then be able to describe those things in the detail of the expectations and the learning that they entail, because there are consequences associated with assessment. And we need to be sure that the information we provide to those students about how they can change their learning, or to their parents, needs to be actually embedded in the stuff we're trying to get them to learn. And the final one is record keeping. That the records that teachers and students keep, because it will be both, are the evidence that support the decisions that are made about their learning. So what you keep as records is what you have to justify the actions that you make, the teaching that you do, the reporting that you give to parents. And it's much more than a marks book. It's much more than a series of tick marks. It is communicating the ideas, because those marks, those ticks, are symbolic representations of some kind of learning that this child has undertaken, that you want to be able to describe in some detail. So I'm going to close by just saying that using evidence for teaching and learning is a pretty complicated but very exciting part, I think, of what education is today. We have moved into an era where we really do want and believe that it's possible to have high-quality education and high-quality learning for all. That in fact, none of us have ever learned as much as we could possibly have learned if we'd had a set of conditions to do it. We never do. There is always more to learn. There's always another there. You know, you think you're getting there, and then there's another there. You're always on that journey. It's the same for our students. We can make their learning so much more powerful by using assessment to make that learning efficient in the moment-by-moment interactions that we have in classrooms and in instruction and in feedback. It's going to take looking at a whole range of forms of evidence. It is not just marks. It's all kinds of evidence, from running records to observations to worksheets to questioning in class. It's being clear about why we're doing it and planning the assessment at the same time as we plan the instruction, and then actually changing the instruction based on what we learn in the assessment, rather than planning the instruction and using the assessment just to say go, no go, got it, didn't get it. That the assessment is an integral part of the learning, and that's going to take leadership, it's going to take support, and it's going to take collaboration. That kids' learning is something that requires a concerted, collaborative team effort, so that every one of those kids who sits in front of us each day actually gets the best, and that assessment is the key to that.
We hope that you have the opportunity to share and discuss further on the purpose of assessment and how it can be used to inform our teaching. All of our previous professional learning webcasts are available on the Curriculum Services Canada website at www.curriculum.org. Thank you for watching today. We look forward to connecting with you again on May 24th for our next production, Unlocking the Potential of Aboriginal Students. Thank you, and until the next time.